Welcome to the podcast. Every moment is sacred, where we interweave meditation and healing into everyday life. I am your host, Rain Elizabeth Stickney. Now, let us begin. Michael Gibian, I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you for visiting Every Moment is Sacred for the second time. I had such a great conversation with you before, and I'm interested in what we're going to dive into today because you have some books on the market now, and we can talk about the books, we can talk about somatics, we can talk about spirituality, the work you do, freedom, personal choice, wherever this conversation takes us. But to begin, I'm wondering, what are you grateful for today?
Health. Yeah, I'm very fortunate to have a body and mind that are working well. And I really don't take that for granted. I'm 58, so I'm looking ahead at my elders and seeing how that changes in a blink of an eye. And really enjoying it now.
Yeah, health is so important. What a wonderful thing to be grateful for. What inspired you to write books?
I felt like it was important at this stage in my work and my life to lay out some of my ideas that I've been gathering and developing and learning in these decades that I've been working with people. And so a way to put it out there, help more people beyond the people that I can help directly, almost like a public record of my ideas and thoughts as well. Yeah, so in a way, a little bit of a legacy type thinking, as well as just trying to help as many people as I can, trying to amplify that.
When you help people, how do you know you're being helpful? Like, what is the exchange that happens where you might get a sense of, oh, that worked, or I'm so glad to be helping this person? What is it like for you to be a helper in this world?
I think often it's moments where the person I'm working with will express a little bit of distance on something that previously took up all of their bandwidth. So maybe like fear, for instance, where fear goes from they're immobilized from fear to they can see fear there lurking, and yet they still take action despite the fear, and it might be imperfect action, but they still keep moving forward. And so those are the moments where I can tell that I'm helping them and they're helping themselves, because that's the beginning of not waiting till fear is gone, not waiting till the conditions are just so, not making it conditional, but just noticing what's happening and taking the right skillful, productive steps forward anyway.
That sounds like a lot of mindfulness.
It does require, yes. That's part of why I teach all of my clients that are willing how to practice mindfulness, because I find it an invaluable, if not essential, tool to be able to introspect and notice what's going on somatically, emotionally, psychologically. And so then we're very much, and then mindfulness also, because I trained in Hakomi with Ron Kurtz, so mindfulness becomes a non-ordinary state that we're both in, or in a group we're all in, like you and I are in right now.
We are in our own non-ordinary state. It's growing as we sink deeper into conversation.
Exactly. And that in itself is super regulating to the nervous system, and then co-regulating to our system that we're creating, which is a big part of how I see and work with people as well. Is I'm using my nervous system to invite theirs into a more regulated state. And then they do that in their relationships as well. And that's super powerful.
Since you do that so consciously, you invite people into regulation with you. How do you regulate your own state prior to or after a session so that you can offer such a gift?
That's a good question. And a lot of my students ask this. I have decades of mindfulness practice under my belt, so to speak, and I do a lot of self-care. I exercise well and I eat well and I live in a beautiful place and I breathe pretty clean air. So I'm at a huge advantage in that way. And then I have little micro practices that I use whenever I need to keep aligning. It's a feeling of aligning with what's relevant to self as I see it, so that in each moment I'm aligned. And when I notice I start to veer away and I start to get tense or hung up, or then I'm using my breath and my body and awareness to keep coming back to that alignment. And when I work with others, I set an intention, but I'm also practicing to have my nervous system regulation be so robust that when our two nervous systems come into interplay, there's only one outcome really possible, which is that their nervous system gets entrained towards that state. And it's not the state that I have, it's the state that they're wanting, right? That's what they're there for. So I feel like that's a big part of what I'm providing as well. My nervous system is attempting to be really stable. And so bringing them into that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And are there ever moments where you start to feel a little wonky, where the dysregulation starts to happen? And as a counselor and a meditation teacher, I can say in my own experience, there can be so much information in the moments when I get dysregulated. It can be very meaningful for that to happen. So in no way do I mean that judgmentally. But do you also sometimes feel, oh, my nervous system is going in this other direction, out of alignment or something like that?
Yes. And you're right. It's information. And so I'm not judging it. I'm noticing it. If I have a conversation with it, I'm speaking kindly to it, like I would a young child or a puppy I'm training. And again, ushering, inviting, reminding, because what I know is that all the while, even if I'm getting dysregulated, there's this other thing that's also true, which is that my core self is, I feel, ever regulated. So I just have to, how do I find my way back?
Yeah.
And I think a long time of practice and also having practices at the ready are like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs so that I can find my way back over and over and over again.
I'm thinking back to our first podcast conversation. And when I listened to that moment in time with you, I like to think about it as a spiritual autobiography, as though you were telling some really important details of your life story in a spiritual way. And I'm wondering if that rings true for you, just to bridge back then to this moment. Does it ring true that you have a spiritual autobiography?
Absolutely. I do. And on your podcast, I talk about it, and I'm happy to talk about it. But in my work, I'm also a pragmatist.
Yeah.
And I see myself as a secular person. And so the way I define spirituality is when I'm really present with this moment and I'm not fighting it. I'm not at odds with it. I'm fully accepting of, and the I and the moment, that division drops away, and then there's just the moment. There's an old Chinese poem that talks about the poet looking at the mountain. So it's the mountain and me, and then the me drops away, and then it's just the mountain left. And so it's that metaphor, that feeling.
I think there's a Cat Stevens song about that as well.
Yeah, there probably is. Yes. Of course, it's a good metaphor. Yeah.
It really is. Yeah. Yeah. So tell me more about your books. I have two of them in front of me. I have the first book in the workbook, but I hear there is also a second book and a third coming. So share with me what about these books are you offering to the world, and what is really exciting you about them?
Well, the initial premise was that I'm seeing how modern life is challenging our ancient nervous systems in a way that they haven't evolved to be really ready to handle the level of input. And we're seeing that statistically, the levels of depression and anxiety in our country, at least in the US and probably globally, I would imagine, people feeling more disconnected than ever, even though we're also connected. And I know that what I'm calling psychological literacy is a tool and a roadmap for people to bolster themselves. It's like a life raft for them to grab onto and not feel like they're going under quite so much. And in the 5 keys, I'm outlining what I think are pretty universal psychological insights, skills, tools, ways of being that in the feedback I'm getting from readers and people that I'm coaching and working with seems to be actually working. And the second book then takes those 5 keys, because the first book is very much what I think of as intrapersonal. It's all work that I do within myself. And then the second book is then noticing how do I then stay myself in relationship to others. Because I think most people that do personal growth type work inevitably find that their relationships and the people around them haven't necessarily kept up or changed. And so then they bump into, well, I've done all this work and yet now I'm still triggered because that person still happens to be themselves still.
Yes. And what do you say to that? This is such a common question.
Well, the carryover of the initial 5 keys into relationship are ways that we're then looking at relationships not only as a mirror, but as now I've gone from regulating my own nervous system to how do we co-regulate each other. We also look at, I work a lot with parts, like Schwartz's internal family systems type parts. And so I introduced that idea. So then there's multiples of us in the room, not just all of my parts, but all of the other person's parts as well. And looking at just the simple thing of like, who's in this conversation? And maybe we should sort out who are the ones relating before we even have this conversation, depending on how important that is, right? So things like that. So we're taking those psychological literacy skills, and applying them into how we're relating. And I actually believe that the right relationship with the right other can actually heal a lot of what is challenging us. So if it's a healthy enough relationship, I feel like that's the place where we can do a lot of our own healing, is in relationship as well.
And how does that happen from your perspective? How does that relational healing become so personal and in a healthy relationship for both people? So there's the relational healing, but the personal healing happening as well. How do you make sense of that?
I can stay regulated with another. I get to feel and experience myself not in a bubble, but in a relational way where I'm still over here and the other's over there, but they're allowing me to really see clearly what's going on and what gets activated in me in relationship to them that I don't get to see when I'm just me on my cushion for instance, right? Or in my own space. And that can be super illuminating if the relationship not only allows for that, but supports that and wants that. And then the other gets to do the same. And so we get to see ourselves more clearly in the moment. And then we also get to see each other. And when that's done, when that's held well and it's done without judgment and with care, that's really powerful, really healing.
I'm thinking about some different relationship issues that I either experience personally or in my work. And it seems like themes of grief and anger are really common when a couple or a person's relationship with the world is at play in a therapeutic realm. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts or feelings about anger and grief in a healing realm.
So, first of all, I try and hold them as information, not as directives. And so and this is how I work with clients as well, but I try and feel into what is this feeling trying to teach me? What is it trying to show me? What is it educating me about? And so actually key one in my first book is called Feel Everything. And what I mean by that is that actually it's neuroscientist Jill Bolte Taylor. She did a fantastic TED Talk about having a stroke that a lot of people probably have seen. Yeah. But she developed this idea that our emotions are on a 90-second cycle. And so there's this beautiful metaphor of riding a 90-second wave of emotion. And it's almost like a very tidy pendulation or titration of you're just staying with it for a little bit and then you can go on, and you're staying with it for a little bit. And what I notice in myself, and a lot of clients are seeing this, is that when you can ride that 90-second wave and you can really just let it be there, that what often happens that leads to the grief or the anger is the story that we start to tell ourselves about it that is coupled to the feeling that we don't even realize is there. And so often it's not the emotion itself that's the problem, but it's our relationship to it. And the part that's broken about our relationship is that we've coupled thoughts about the feeling. We're not just letting the feeling be there by itself. And so that segues perfectly to key two, which is basically don't believe everything you think. So when we can start to cast doubt on just because the thoughts originate in here doesn't mean they're true, that allows me to create some space that uncouples the judgment I have and the not allowing of the feeling to just be the feeling. And so that kind of sorts out the relationship that I can have with my emotions. And that softens all of it. Obviously, this is a simplistic way to look at it. But an anger in particular, I feel like, is an emotion that is reactive to something more vulnerable that's typically underlying that. And so when we can soften our anger, then we can allow ourselves to feel what's usually more subconscious to us is a more vulnerable, more tender, more painful feeling. And the anger is usually about the fact that somebody's making us feel that, or some situation is making us feel that. And that feels terrible. But when I can feel that the tenderness more clearly, again, that gives me more accurate information about what's really needing tending.
And is that thought, somebody's making me feel this anger, or the world or this situation is making me feel angry, are you seeing that as a thought that might not be something we want to believe as we're thinking it?
It's a perfect example of a thought that we might not want to believe, yes. Yeah, it's almost silly to say that, but yes. What I'm trying to do is open up the field a little bit so that I just start to notice that, because all of us have the experience of doubting the thought that's coming from someone else. right? We can easily discount what somebody else thinks, but now we need to be aware that the thoughts that are generated over here are just as unreliable. And there's a lot of great research around that. The thoughts that are the most persistent and the loudest tend to feel the most real. And that's a really deep misunderstanding. And so again, we just keep coming back to, can I stay in an open-minded place long enough to let the sort of loud thoughts kind of come and go, and then get to what are the deeper truths that are available that are much quieter, much more reliable types of thoughts.
And how would we know when we get to one of those much more reliable thoughts?
Great question. One quick answer would be that it aligns with what I think of as my core self. So in parts work, I'm often thinking about, who does this thought belong to? And so I can feel with some practice and my clients with some direction, they learn to feel into, oh, that's part of me that thinks that way, because part of me has this feeling that they're having thoughts about, versus that's a thought that's aligned with a deeper, it's more my inner compass. And that becomes a more distinct, and that's part of why I like working somatically, is that I'm not just doing it intellectually, but I'm feeling it in my body. And then it becomes a really recognizable, it's almost like a posture that my body can take when those thoughts become true in a way that's aligned.
And let's dive into somatics. I love somatics. And I know you have some Hakomi training. And so speak to me a bit about what somatics are and how a person discerns thoughts from soma, or, in Thomas Hanna somatics, the mind body is one and not two, that there is no distinction. It's all one continuum. But there are many different important thinkers in the field of somatics. So how are you holding body, mind, soma? What's true for you?
I would agree that mind body are two sides of the same coin, and it's a two-way exchange. So what my body experiences or expresses is directly tied to psychology in my mind, and what my mind thinks and repeats and embeds in deep grooves also shows up in my body, literally in my tissues and my posture, in the way I hold myself, what my body feels is true about myself and the world. Those are, so as much as I love talk therapy, and I've done it myself as a client for years, I feel like when I started learning about how my body could also participate and be explored and show me what's going on beyond the story. So Ron Kurtz, the creator of Hakomi, often would say to us, listen to the story, but listen for the storyteller.
Ooh.
And the storyteller is in the body, right? Little micro movements or things that the body is showing us, if we're paying close attention, that is revealing who the storyteller is versus the story. Because I can tell you firsthand in my own therapy, I know my story really well. I can tell it really well. I can be dramatic, I can be undramatic, whatever, but I can tell it. And that doesn't necessarily get me somewhere new. What gets me somewhere new, in my case, is how does that organize me in my body? And so that just gives me more tools to work with.
Mm-hmm. When you're sitting with somebody, whether on the screen or in person, and you're doing some work, I would say healing work, but maybe you don't use that term. Would you say healing work or something else?
I don't know if I would say that, but I'm comfortable with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're doing your work with the good person. And is there a way that you kind of sense in if they are speaking from their mind or body or heart, or I mean, I do believe the speaker has authority over their experience, but as a helping practitioner, are there things that you notice that inform you about what might be happening for the person you're sitting with?
Yes, there are body movements and postures. Somebody might talk about something and they might look away. For instance, that might be something that's worth pursuing. And so those things, I just think of them as things that make me curious. I don't decide I know what that means. That's for my client to explore, right? And if it makes me curious, then we're hopefully working slowly enough where we can start to just like, well, let's go from where we are to let's turn towards that part of you that's turning away. And that brings it to their attention. And they're like, oh yeah, I notice how I don't, metaphoric, I don't want to look at the thing I'm talking about, right? So now we have more information. And, if you think about neurologically, we're trying to create neural nets. So we're trying to deepen how much of the brain is participating in what they're experiencing. And so they're not only telling a story, but now we're starting to get information about the storyteller who doesn't want to look at what's going on. I also notice in people's language that, so I feel like my core self has qualities of compassion and kindness and calm and centeredness and things like that. And so when a client is saying things that seem more contracted or judgmental or something other than qualities that I know come from self, then that helps me notice that too. And again, I become curious about that and then ask them to as well. And so it's often a process of my noticing things that they may or may not be noticing. And then I'm constantly just pushing them gently to go inside and notice, and they can go, oh yeah, that's right. That I didn't realize I was feeling this way. Right. And so it requires going slowly enough. And that's the beauty of mindfulness, is that when I'm mindful, I'm able to hang out just above my subconscious material. And so that I'm catching what was previously unknown to me just as it's coming up into awareness. And I'm right there to notice it. And rather than it comes into consciousness and then suddenly it takes over my whole behavior, and then I'm suddenly yelling at my partner and have no idea why. Right. So that, and then we notice then, or they notice and they say, what the heck, right? So, but ideally I'm noticing just as it's percolating up, and it's like, oh, there it is. And again, with real non-judgmental attitude and curiosity. I love filling the space with curiosity, because I feel like that sort of pushes out judgment and other sort of attitudes that aren't as helpful. And curiosity is a really great field to play in.
I agree. I love curiosity. And you bring up a good point about that yelling that can happen in relationship and how a person can be overtaken. And it can happen to any of us at any time. And we all can become more skillful. But it brings me to a question of one of my meditation students about how to stop and regulate the nervous system in daily life. So it doesn't have to be in relationship. It could be traffic. It could be reading news and getting dysregulated. It could be any of these things that could tweak any of our nervous systems into an agitated state. And perhaps you have some ideas of how a person might recenter, realign, find that core self again.
I do have ideas. One idea is to turn to almost any kind of breath work. And I like a lot of breath works, but I particularly like, for people that are new to this, I like box breathing, which is a type of breathing where for whatever 4 counts of your own breath is, you inhale for 4, you hold your breath for 4, you exhale for 4, you hold your breath for 4 and you keep going like that. And even in a minute, you can really start shifting your nervous system. So if I'm sitting in traffic and I notice I'm getting frustrated with people cutting me off and I start becoming like the people that I'm annoyed by, I just find a way to remember, oh yeah, I don't like feeling this way. So box breathing or many other types of breathing, I just think that works. I love the physiologic sigh where you do a double inhale and then an exhale. So you inhale. So it's like you're mimicking a sigh, which is a nervous system re-regulator. Something a little more cognitive, I like the STOP acronym, where you just remember, like, I'm being annoyed, so I just literally stop. I take a breath. I observe what's going on, and then I proceed with my day. And that can be a 30-second sort of disruptor of what can just be building, building, building. I just throw in the stop technique, and it just disrupts the pattern. And it's not that it necessarily solves it, but in the middle of a board meeting or on a Zoom call or something, maybe that's not the time to solve it, right? So it just gives me a very quick way to interrupt that pattern, and then I could put it to the side for now and come back to it.
Tell me,
yeah.
tell me again what STOP stands for. STOP.
Yeah. So it stands for stop, take a breath, observe what's going on, and then proceed with your day.
Brilliant. Mm-hmm. It's so helpful to have those interrupters. And what I find is the more we practice them, so let's say if I practice stop and I do it more and more often, there can be a somatic memory and even a cognitive memory, but a habit that's formed for the sake of good.
Right. Exactly. And the third key in my book is practice what you're becoming. And that's a good example of, rather than practicing behaviors that are reactionary, I'm practicing responsiveness, right? So that's a great example of something very simple that we can do that's just embedding in our nervous system and in our cognition, that I'm practicing what I'm becoming versus practicing things that are what I don't want. And there's a big difference in how that informs our nervous systems.
Yes, because habits can be so subconscious and sometimes unconscious, which is the formation of a habit. And any of us, again, we are all in the game together. We can have maladapted habits that may have served us at some point, and maybe we outgrew them, but we didn't let go of them. And so to become aware of those responses that are really getting in the way of our happiness is so powerful.
I have one more that I'd like to share, which is I feed myself a little mantra, which is, I notice this, and I do this especially relationally. And since my wife is mainly the main other that I'm around a lot, if I notice I'm starting to move away from alignment with my core self, I'll just stop and ask myself this, which is, here's the next moment. What could I do that would actually lead to what I want? So rather than continuing to try and convince her that I'm right or get her to see my perspective, what would actually lead to what I want? And so what I want is connection, right? What I want is clarity. What I want is flow. So we have to know what we value in that moment. But since that's pretty easy to sort out, then I can immediately, how do I align with that? And then immediately I can drop, oh, I don't care about being right. I just want to get back to this place that I know is there for us. And from there, we can sometimes go back and realize, oh, that's what this was about, right? But what happens, and when we go back, if we look at that from the lens of parts, is that when I'm mired in trying to make you understand my perspective, that's not my core self. And if you're doing the same, so then that mantra of what would actually lead to what I'm wanting helps me go right back to, oh, okay, let me go back to what I really value. Mm-hmm. I like to work with values a lot because in any moment, I can ask myself, so in this moment, what do I value? Oh, I value integrity. Okay, well, let me act like it. And that isn't always easy. I have to drop other things that are in play, but it at least gives me a course correction. It at least tells me I want to go in this direction. So then what do I do to go there?
Yeah, great inquiry. So, in your first book, you have these 5 keys, and it's about the self practice. And in the second book, there's more of a relational aspect. And up and coming, what might we find in the third book?
The third book is the 5 keys of belonging.
Oh.
And so, as we were chatting a little bit before, it's a subject that can be challenging to talk about because, especially the English language, isn't really old enough in a way to talk about these subjects well. So I think I've done it, and many people have done it, but I'm trying to point the reader to assumptions that they have that they might not even realize they have. And each key is successively trying to loosen our notions and assumptions and ideas about ourselves and about reality and about the world around us, what's possible and available, all leading towards the final key where all of that loosening leads us to connecting to what I call home, which is just a true and deep feeling and experience of home.
How do we know when we're home?
The definition I'm using of home in this book, the we dissolves in a way that I'm noticing that and I'm still using I language here, right? But so I could be sitting in my garden, and instead of wishing it were sunnier or cooler, or that the birds would come around like they did yesterday, I naturally fall into alignment with the way the day is unfolding as it is. And I find myself not at odds, but aligned with each moment just being the way it is. And so there's that's where I feel like I'm dissolving into the experience around me. I'm just part of it. And there isn't so I talk a lot about, so in those moments where I'm in the garden and I wish it wasn't quite so hot, there's a narrator in me that's noticing and saying, oh, I wish it wasn't so sunny, or I wish that bird would come around. And that narrator is useful, but it's also problematic. And so then one of the questions that I pose is, when I notice the narrator, I can also notice that there's the noticer behind the narrator. And that noticer behind the narrator is part of the world around me in a way that is completely aligned and doesn't need it to be any different than it is. I think that's a good way to talk about what I'm calling home. And the nature of home is not a romantic love, but a love that we have all felt at some point, hopefully, in our lives, that's bigger than a romantic relational type love, but it's sort of the texture of reality in that moment.
You are reminding me of the spiritual analogy of a candle flame, where if I were to hold a candle right here, we could see the outline of the flame. And if I were to begin to hold it up to the sun, there might be a moment where I can still see a bit of the outline, but I can see that there's fire, same. But then if I keep it up there longer, the outline of the candle flame will actually dissolve, and there's only fire. There's only oneness. And your description of home gave me that deep sense of being resonant with the story of the candle flame. So there's a workbook too, and what might a person find if they opened up the workbook that goes along with your writing?
The workbook goes with the first book for a couple of reasons. One is that, for one, I wanted all these books to be super distilled and succinct. They're all around 100 pages. because I want there to be very little friction and hurdles toward, to getting to the book and reading them. And so the workbook being separate was in part because I wanted to keep the first book really succinct. But it also provides a framework by which the reader independently can sort of take themselves through a mirror image of what I do live with clients, where we do a 6-week program based on the 5 keys, with the 6th week being an integration week where we kind of take stock of what we've learned. And so the companion workbook guides the reader through that 6-week series where it reminds them what it is that we learned. And there are compassionate inquiry style prompts. There are further practices, because each book also has practices that I feel are really integral to. It's not the kind of book where you just sit, because you could read the book in under an hour. It's not that kind of book. It's where you want to take your time, go through it, and try the practices. And a lot of readers have come back and said, "Oh, I just keep coming back to chapter 2. I just noticed that that's the one that I really," and they just. So it's more that kind of thing. So the workbook kind of slows the process down and deepens it and gives some structure to it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'm thinking about how when I first met you, you were described as the mindfulness coach. Wait, no, I got it wrong again. The mindfulness mentor.
Yes. Yes.
But now I can refer to you as the inner leadership coach. Do I have that right?
Yes. So many monikers, yeah.
Yes. I mean, what do we call ourselves? I'm asked very often, what do you mean you're a healer?
Right.
What is a healer? So words are funny in that way.
Asking more about it.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes, I don't know if this defines you at all, but for myself, we're choosing to work outside of the box, meaning that I choose to work outside of many boxes. And that gives me the freedom to self-define. And it also gives me the freedom to find my own self-integrity and what words point to what it is that I offer. Is there some of that discernment and self-definition that you find in your work as well?
Absolutely. I've always felt throughout my professional career that I operate in the gray area between clearly defined worlds. And the way I practice Hakomi, for instance, after learning Hakomi, I started working with a longtime Hakomi therapist here in Santa Barbara who actually taught at the Hakomi Institute. But they didn't do any of the somatic interventions because in California, you're not allowed to touch people if you identify as a psychotherapist and are licensed as such. And so I found myself that the place I want to be in integrity and also to offer the world the help that I want to be offering, that I find myself not out of rebellion, but just naturally just finding that I'm not clearly definable. Clearly, I sit between the worlds in a way, and over time I've become more and more comfortable with being in between.
I am so grateful for your offers in the world and how you work with people, and the great blessing of getting to know you a bit over time. And I hope there's more to come. I think that's why I laughed a little bit, because I hope that I continue to get to know you over time. And one question that is coming up for me, we touched on it already, but when I sit with somebody like yourself who does similar work to me, but different, similar but different, sometimes I like to bounce things off of another individual who has some expertise. And something that comes up in my work sometimes is this inquiry around how to deal with difficult emotions in meditation. And whether or not it's meditation per se, I think your work is very deep in the realm of how people work with themselves internally. And so just to go a little bit deeper on the notion of difficult emotions and what in the world to do with them. And we have the 90-second feeling, and we can watch that and we can go deeper into that. But I'm just wondering if you have more wisdom to share about the difficult emotions that we all feel sometimes.
Yeah, that's an important question, and I don't have a prepared answer for that, obviously. But I want to start with saying that part of why I shifted my own practice 25 years ago to Vipassana was because it allowed me to interact with, grapple with, and heal my own difficult emotions in a way that my previous practice basically became spiritual bypass, where it allowed me to sort of hover above my psycho-emotional self. And so I choose to practice Vipassana for that reason. So I do welcome the difficult emotions that can come with it. But your question is about how do we handle and manage that, right? And so I guess I'll come back to, I've found so powerful this notion of uncoupling the emotion from the thought that immediately precedes it, which often is, this is inconvenient, or it's messy, or I don't want it, or not now, or any of that is, I really like to distinguish what I think is the difference between pain and suffering. And pain is the part of life that's inevitable, and suffering is the part that is optional and often self-created. And one of the ways that we're creating that self-created suffering is the not wanting in some way that emotion to be there right then the way it is. And that's a challenging practice, but a super liberating one at the same time.
Absolutely.
So any kind of kindness I can show myself around having feelings and thoughts about not wanting this now or how it is, I try and show myself a lot of kindness around that. That kindness at least isn't adding to the problem any further. Because in meditation, there's a common thing that can happen. And in Sanskrit, there's a word that I can't think of that talks about thoughts that lead to thoughts that lead to thoughts. And maybe we call that rumination now in modern psychology. But it's a common feature of meditation for a lot of people. And so we need to find ways to interrupt that, right? And so I think that those thoughts leading to thoughts is the self-added suffering. So if I can start to tease that apart and create a little bit of space there where I can see that that's happening, that can be the beginning.
Thank you for sharing that wisdom. I really appreciate it. Is there more that you would like to touch in on, Michael, or anything that you'd like to go further into that we've already discussed?
I would like to encourage our listeners to feel like they don't have to wait for their life to be any way in particular to continue or to start on the path, their path of greater self-knowing. It doesn't need to be any particular way. It can be messy and imperfect. And like I talked about before, where I can feel angry and be aware that I'm angry and still take a step forward, or I can feel fear and still take a step forward. That making our readiness conditional is something we should shine a light on and notice that we're actually causing ourselves harm by saying, well, when I'm not so busy, or when the kids are off to college, or any of those things that we all do, and I do, to be aware that that's what we're doing, and to feel softness and kindness towards those parts of us that decide that, oh, I'm not quite ready. That's really useful information. And just doing that actually means you're already in the process. Like it's so common when a client will schedule time with me, and then, in 2 weeks when we meet, the process already begun way before they even booked the appointment, but let alone waiting for the appointment, it's already underway. And so just starting to notice that, oh, I've made it conditional. I've decided to put it off for and to even use language like part of me decided that things need to be this way or that way. The micro practice I use in Key 2 for Don't Believe Everything You Think is what I call the thought prefix, which is just to say, instead of having a thought, just to say, I'm having the thought that I should wait till the kids go off to college. Mm-hmm. And you can see how, versus just having the thought, it creates a little bit of space. It creates a little more object subject, where instead of the kids should go off to school before I'm ready to take on a meditation practice, versus I'm having the thought that, suddenly I'm onto myself a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And people really love that practice because it's very easy to deploy, and it creates just enough room to just be more aware of what I'm doing.
Yeah, I hear you talking about the seer-seen differentiation. And in Sanskrit, that's called Drigdrisha Viveka. And you're right, it's so valuable. It's so valuable to notice, I'm thinking, I'm having a thought. Oh, this is the thought I'm having, and continue to step away from the object, which in this case would be the thought.
And in psychology, we call that name it to tame it, right? There are all kinds of really good benefits cognitively and somatically to doing that as well. And so it's not just a great ancient practice, but modernly confirmed to be good as well. That's my sweet spot, is when it's 3,000 years old and really rigorous science has also said, yeah, we agree. That's the place I like to be.
Efficacy. It's amazing. What we have always known coming into the modern era with science being able to validate the effectiveness of it. It's just brilliant. It's such an interesting human history we have over the large arc of time.
In my soon-to-come third book, a big part of the book is oriented around a really old and my favorite Zen story. If I could tell a quick version of it, I'd love to. So there's two farmers that are neighbors, and one of the farmers, his horse escapes the fencing and gets away, and the neighbor says, oh, that's so terrible. How are you going to plow your fields? And the neighbor who loses the horse says, maybe. And then a few days later, the horse comes back and a couple wild horses that are following it, and he captures all the horses. And so the neighbor says, what a boon. And our farmer says, maybe. And then his eldest son tries to tame one of the wild horses and breaks his arm doing so. And the neighbor says, oh, so terrible. You won't have help with the crops. And the farmer says, maybe. And then the army comes through conscripting all the able-bodied young men, but they leave behind his son because he has a broken arm. And the neighbor, of course, has some box that he puts it in. And our farmer says, maybe. And that story keeps going. And that story is all of us. And sometimes we're the neighbor who needs to define and decide what something means, which is common. And I feel such compassion for myself and all of us when we're in that place, because it's not the funnest place to be. And other times we can be the farmer that says maybe, that can stay spacious enough where we don't have to decide what this thing that's happening means. It can be painful and we can feel our feelings, and we still don't have to decide what it means. We can just be with it. And that seems a preferable road to the suffering I feel comes from having to always define and decide. And so that's a big part of what I'm trying to help people with, and still working on myself, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a beautiful parable. Thank you for telling it and sharing it with all of us. How can everyone find you, Michael? My
website is michaelgibian.com. And on the website, you can learn more about the work I do, and there are links to buying the books on Amazon. And on Amazon, if you type in Michael Gibian, The 5 Keys, then you can find the whole series there. That's the kind of the main way. I'm a little bit on social media, but not reliably. So yeah, my website is probably the best way.
Excellent.
Yeah, I've tried to make it a good resource. There's blog posts and there's a lot of podcasts, like our previous podcast is on there as well. So people can learn a lot more about what we're doing.
And you've been on another show, or maybe a few others, but I do like to stay up to date, like, oh, what is Michael doing? And so I have listened to you in other spaces as well. So in closing, Michael, I'm so grateful that you joined me here today, and I'm so glad for this conversation. And again, thank you for the work that you do in the world. Thank you for being a light that's sharing the light, that sees the light in other people.
Well, I feel the same. And I know you're doing your own version of this work. I feel a kinship with you. That's why I keep coming back.
Oh, lucky me. And what is one wish, or you've already bestowed us with many wonderful wishes. What is one more wish that you would like to offer to the world?
Be a little gentler with yourself. To extend a little more compassion and kindness and gentleness towards yourself and those around you. A little more grace.
Thank you. I'll hold that in my heart today, especially. Thank you so much for listening. It has been a great joy to have your presence here in this podcast. Thank you for being my audience. I welcome you to celebrate the joy and wisdom in your life exactly as it is. And I welcome you to feel loved, fully loved, exactly as you are. Namaste.